It's a great delight to be here. One of the things I do is actually sit on the board of the ATP and have done so since 2005. And as a precursor to what I'm going to talk about, it is fantastic to see the ATP thriving and so successful with urban growth. It's been a long transition, but one of the transformational things for this whole complex has been the creation of a really good commercial and employment hub over where the Channel 7 sign is, where there is a very highly concentrated media sector over in that building at sort of like at 5 o'clock over there. So that intervention had a major impact on this space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sydney as a productive, growing and livable city. And that, I guess, is the mantra that we would all adopt here, no matter where we come from. And to talk about how the need for collaboration, which is a key theme here, I notice, and partnership across many, many sectors and community groups and wider community voices is essential for getting really good outcomes. Now, this is sort of like a contextual scene-setting map. It is a map that was published in the Committee for Sydney's publication, which we did with SGS Economics, on mapping the economic productivity of the wider metropolitan area in terms of value creation per dollar, per hour worked. And you can see, the very black spots are exactly, they're in the typical spots that you would expect, like Sydney CBD. There are lots of other dark green and better spots, but it sets the context for where the highest economic value is created. I'm not saying in this that economic value is the greatest, the only measure that we should be using, but it does set the scene for saying that Sydney's central core, and other places too, but Sydney's central core is above all responsible for a lot of income, which means that a huge amount of tax is raised in Sydney. It's estimated that 82% of all the taxes raised in Sydney actually goes to the federal government. So that builds us into something which I'm not going to discuss today, but we have a serious issue in our large cities like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane of what they call vertical fiscal imbalance, which is a very technical way of saying a lot of the money goes out and not quite as much comes back in. So moving to the next slide, if you look at the concentration of social advantage and disadvantage, it's very clear that there is quite a clear concentration of disadvantage in southwestern Sydney, other areas too, but what's clear is southwestern Sydney has a high concentration of low-income households. So if we're planning Sydney's future for the next 20 and 30 years in the context that we are going through one of the most intense periods of population growth, we know that our economic activity and our spatial development will have to, at the same time, enhance productivity as well as address the issue of spatial disadvantage. Now, the way that the Committee for Sydney takes a very strong view, and I wholeheartedly endorse it, the committee is led by a CEO, a very good man, Tim Williams, who I think will be on a panel or has been on a panel. We think that the two key issues for metropolitan Sydney, on the one hand, is to build the existing productivity in the productive centres, and on the other hand, build other polycentres, Parramatta being a key one. Because if you look at this map here, a lot of the economic value is concentrated on the east coast of the city, where pretty much where we are now, and further north on the eastern coast, the CBD in particular, and to a much lesser degree, North Sydney. But there are other sort of pockets of higher, economic productivity around Parramatta, Rose Hill. That needs to be intensified. Macquarie Park, and Marsfield, which is a fairly recent origin and is a very, very high current growth rate. So what we need to do is we need to build and intensify the productivity in the centre at the same time as creating polycentric hubs. Now, moving on. Now, we've lost a bit of colour in the translation, but this is to make 2 points. this slide is to make 2 points to you. The first point is that Sydney, I don't know if you can read the numbers, but Sydney has a population in this map of about 4.2 million people, 4.2 million people, with a very high population growth rate. In terms of the spatial footprint it covers, it is not far off London, which has a population of close to 14 million people. So, and then if you go, Melbourne's got a similarly wide spatial, covers a lot of space for its population size. We are a very low density city. And if you think of London, which has almost, at least 3 times as many people on a similar footprint, nobody really thinks of London as a high density city. So I think that shows us that and if you look at Singapore too, Singapore is over there on your far right. Singapore has a population very similar to Sydney's, but its footprint is much smaller. Now, nobody is advocating Singapore density everywhere across Sydney, but it's interesting to note that one of the reasons that Singapore has become very much a financial services hub in the Asia-Pacific region is its location on all the trade corridors on the one hand, but secondly, that its lifestyle is considered to be vastly better than other comparable cities. For example, the growth of financial services in Singapore is often being driven by the out-migration of people from the Hong Kong financial centre because of lifestyle and urban amenity issues like air quality. So with 4 million people on that footprint, I'm not advocating it, but it's very clear you can have a high quality lifestyle. So that's really the point of that one. The other point of the slide, which doesn't really show up in this slide, but it's a very important one, with our governance structure, we are much more fragmented than any other comparable city, with the possible exception of Melbourne, but that's a lot more concentrated than Sydney is. We have 41 local government areas in that space. Lots of other cities have a couple of local government areas, but they don't have nearly as many as we do, which makes really good, strong metropolitan planning quite a challenge. There is, if you like, a huge, huge chasm between the metropolitan planning that state governments have to do, and they create agencies like UrbanGrowth to help with the delivery of, is actually that the state government is very large. It covers a very large state by international standards, and it has responsibility for rural and regional areas as well. Although it is principally charged with metropolitan planning, it is a very big organisation to be doing that on the one hand, and on the other hand you have a huge gap down to the size of very small, in spatial and population terms, local government. So we think that that governance deficit is a real challenge to metropolitan planning, to sound metropolitan strategic planning. And we're very glad that the current government the current government together with local government is going to have a very serious look at how to optimise or improve metropolitan planning, because at every turn there are challenges caused by the governance structure that we have. And one of the governance responses, in fact, is to have a multiplicity of government agencies to deliver bits of metropolitan planning, which in turn poses challenges for those agencies and government departments to speak together. So as I said before, what Sydney really needs to do is, on the one hand, to become truly polycentric, where Parramatta can fulfil its destiny to become the second CBD, and I think the auguries are really, really well positioned for that to happen. There is an incredible energy and dynamism emerging in Parramatta, which I think will make it possible, and a lot of intervention by government, state and local. I think Parramatta is actually a really interesting place to watch in Sydney. Of course, the base precinct is too, but Parramatta is another really interesting one. But Parramatta won't be enough. We really need to intensify the productivity, which means the jobs and the housing in other areas like Penrith and Campbelltown, and there are lots of other areas too. So we need to do two things at once, and the Bays precinct, I believe, will become an essential component of Sydney's high productivity growth corridor. Barangaroo is already underway. on the western edge of the CBD. I think that will have a very different character to the Bays Precinct, but I'm just trying to put into context that the Bays Precinct is an essential component of Sydney's future high productivity growth. And that means high intensity jobs, high value creating jobs, and a higher density accommodation, which I'll talk about in a second. So just the governance structure that we have leads in many cases to a very great degree of hyperlocalism and a very high degree of governance fragmentation, which leads to there being a deficit of metropolitan voice or articulation or championing what's in the city's overall interest. And that is very much, the Committee for Sydney sees its role as playing a sort of like a bridge building, a alliance building, a collaboration building role in developing a structure for a metropolitan voice across industries, across cultural organisations, across professional services firms, so that there can be a clearly articulated metropolitan voice for Sydney, which is sometimes not always there. Now, when you have very low, when you have a governance deficit and a lack of cohesive strategic planning, you run the risk of developing much lower levels of intergenerational equity. And, you know, I guess this will be controversial in many quarters, but I think sometimes the development debate in the inner city area is dominated by those with the greatest economic interest in preserving things exactly the way they are. And those people, truthfully, in this day and age with our current demographics, are home-owning baby boomers. So what worries me and the committee in the deliberations and the conversations about our city is that there needs to be a much wider conversation and discussion about what needs to happen, the White Bays being a very, very good example of that. I think you could say that you know, the idea of design thinking is very, very important here. Design thinking is one where you get in the room, and this is a very good example, I hope, of design thinking, the process here and the processes that will follow it, and where the process is important, where you need simultaneously in the room a huge amount of technical experts, the people who've done similar things in other locations on the one hand, and well-informed wider community people and local community people on the other, so that there is a voice and a conversation which captures a much wider perspective of the community. Now, in terms of, you know, urban forms and the principles, I guess the design principles, I would say that Corbusianism in an Australian context is dead. Corbusianism in the sense, and you can think of public housing estates, Redfern Waterloo public housing estate being one of them, where the idea that one big, you know, design ethic, one big, you know, sort of delivered concept plan where all the architecture is very similar and you know, designed as what Corbusier said as housing being a machine for living in, doesn't actually always create the best communities. And you know, that sort of thinking could be considered. Charles Landry spoke yesterday about Cities 1.0 versus Cities 2.0. The Corbusian idea, I would suggest, is very much Cities 1.0, where very dominant uniform architecture prevails, and there is a very low level of variety and diversity and difference across a wide spatial area. I think what we've learned about what communities work today, we can say that variety and diversity is essential for authenticity. Also, what's essential for authenticity when you're building, say, tourist infrastructure is you don't build infrastructure just for tourists, because tourists sense that they're in a tourist-only precinct, and in this day and age, they don't like that so much as feeling that they're experiencing part of the local flavour of a place. So what's essential for a new brownfield development, I think, is that there is a combination of jobs and housing and cultural facilities and lifestyle facilities to create the life and soul of a community. For example, you know, like a large cultural facility is a huge attractor of talent and population, as of course are economic magnets, are employment hubs. So I think that White Bay to succeed will need a lot of employment as well as a lot of housing and even cultural facilities, as well as which, cycling, walking, all these features are essential for anybody's perception of a civilised city in this day and age. So there needs to be vibrancy, there needs to be diversity, and there needs to be a lot of really interesting activation. So people do what they a lot of people tend to do more of these days, is to live more compact inside their homes and want to lead large lifestyles outside their homes. Now, there is the idea that, I would say that demography is destiny, as well as topography and geography being destiny. In the 21st century, there are two groups of people who are kind of pushing and wanting the same kind of what I call well-connected, convenient, walkable urbanity. And they are the Gen Y people who, especially even as they have children, they're not wanting to flee to the suburbs. They're more than happy to trade space for compact urban housing in return for having that access to large lifestyles, walking, cycling, local jobs, nearby jobs, culture, access to lifestyle facilities. At the same time, as the young people want this kind of much more attracted to this lifestyle, we have baby boomers who are living much longer, who are also attracted to this lifestyle, this high dense walkable urbanity, because one of the clear trends is that very young people are much more committed to car ownership and driving around a lot, at the same time as older people choose not to walk around and drive so much. So there is a massive need for walkable and public transport, mass transit opportunities to create livable communities in the future. Now, more people living alone is a real issue. One of the largest growth in household types is actually women reaching retirement age living on their own. So we have women, older women wanting walkable urbanity at the same time as young people and baby boomers in general. Now, just a health warning, this walkable urbanity isn't just what people want. It is one of the greatest antidotes we have to one of the greatest rising health care challenges that we have in the developed world, and especially Australia and the US, which is rising levels of urban obesity. So it's not just fun to live in, it's actually essential to lead an active walking lifestyle. Now, one of the things that will be critical to the success of the Bays Precinct, I think, is doing what often hasn't been done in large developments in Sydney, which is to bring together land use and transport planning together with an understanding of the economic transformations that will be necessary to make it work. And I think that integrated thinking between public transport and land use development will be critical to White Bay's success. Now, just a couple of case studies. One of the just nearby, two very nearby case studies, I'm going to talk a little bit about Darling Harbour on the one hand and Pyrmont on the other, is that Darling Harbour, that's the 1980s manifestation of Darling Harbour, which was only opened in 1988, and already it's largely been demolished. Now, why has that been the case? A lot of people remember the opening of Darling Harbour, and a lot of people were a bit amazed when it happened. The reason that Darling Harbour, I think, has had to be redone is it did suffer from the design principles suffered from that lack of what we now know as authenticity that you need with cities 2.0 and 3.0. Everything was too massive and Corbusianism. There was a big, chunky it was all about the tourist economy and visitors, and people don't really get attracted to that kind of facility or resort. So there is going to be the other big problem with Darling Harbour is that it wasn't knitted and connected with the prevailing area, like the western part of the city on the one hand and Ultimo Pyrmont on the other. It never belonged. People in Sydney never really thought it belonged to them. So, the redevelopment of Darling Harbour has the intention, and I hope the outcome, of really knitting together and fusing the local communities with the new buildings, and appreciating and working with the energy and the dynamism that is already in the area, with UTS, which is a fantastically creative and important part of the revitalisation of Darling Harbour as a knowledge and creative hub, and also all the media industries and businesses that are located there now. So I'm hoping that the lessons that we can learn from Darling Harbour is the big visitor-only development doesn't really work. Now, Pyrmont's another interesting example, just over the road, or just on the right at the edge of the Bays Precinct. Now, that is really interesting because it was similar in its original structure to the Bays Precinct, a little bit more developed, with a lot of heritage buildings there. Pyrmont was built in several stages over many, many years, over 20 years or thereabouts. And what was interesting is that towards the end, of the development cycle, there was a greater degree of verticality of the later developments of Pyrmont. Now, I have to confess, when I was in the city, I was really worried and alarmed by that verticality and the height of those buildings. But when you see Pyrmont now or visit Pyrmont now, you appreciate that verticality gives a dynamism and an energy and a density that is really needed to animate what is now a very, really lively village centre around Harris Street in Pyrmont. And so, the verticality, I'm not saying that there should be this at the Bays Precinct, but the benefit of thinking boldly really does pay dividends. So I hope that the process of future conversations around the Bays does allow for bold thinking, because I can think of other developments just around the corner, Darling Island being a good example, where it's there isn't enough density. It's a bit staid and it looks a bit dull. You do need a bit of energising dynamism, which comes through well-designed density with a lot of public, living large lifestyle facilities and spaces. Now, to my mind, Pyrmont and White Bay is the most fantastic opportunity to learn from what we've learned from other places, like Pyrmont, like Darling Harbour, and more recently from the Central Park development in Chippendale, where a combination of open spaces and vertical density can really enhance a community and, in a sense, create a dynamic community, not just a residential community, but a business community and a cultural community and a lifestyle community that will actually stitch together this area to the rest of the city in a way that hasn't ever happened before. Thank you very much.